They held a firm belief that their tanks could not be defeated. The Type 95 Ha-Go had demonstrated its capabilities against Chinese troops, against Soviet tanks at Khalkhin Gol, and during the rapid conquests across Malaya and the Philippines. Japanese tank operators were convinced their light tanks embodied the height of armored vehicle engineering, ideally matched to the environments of the Pacific jungles and islands. They had overwhelmed every foe they confronted. Their belief was mistaken. The tale of how they came to realize this starts not with failure but with the assurance built up from repeated triumphs. The Ha-Go was far from an accidental success. It was the outcome of meticulous military strategy that started in 1933 when the Japanese Imperial Army identified a significant deficiency in its tank forces. The Type 89 medium tank, which served as Japan's primary tank, could reach only 15 miles per hour. While this was enough to accompany marching infantry, it was completely inadequate for the style of mechanized warfare the army aspired to wage. Japanese military strategists observed with great interest as other countries developed faster, more agile armored units. They sought a vehicle that could keep pace with motorized infantry covering 40 miles per hour by truck, traverse the landscapes of Manchuria and China, and be manufactured in numbers their industrial capacity could handle. The Army Technical Bureau released requirements in July 1933. The new vehicle was to weigh roughly 7 tons, be equipped with a 37 mm cannon, move at speeds of 40 km per hour, and carry armor sufficient to withstand bullets from rifles and machine guns. Above all, it needed to be straightforward to build and repair. Mitsubishi Heavy Industries was awarded the production contract. Designer Tomio Hara, recognized for his work on the Type 89, assumed leadership of the project. His standout contribution was the bell crank suspension, a straightforward but highly efficient mechanism that would set the standard for Japanese tanks for 10 years. By June 1934, Mitsubishi had finalized the initial prototype. Military officials were impressed with the prototype during evaluations in Manchuria and at domestic test sites. The tank was quick, managing 45 km per hour on paved surfaces and sustaining 25 to 30 km per hour over open country. Its maneuverability was notable, with a turn radius remarkable for a tracked vehicle of its dimensions. The Ha-Go's suspension system, featuring the unique bell crank, effectively absorbed impact and allowed the tank to cross challenging ground that halted other vehicles. Its mechanical reliability was ensured by a Mitsubishi 6-cylinder air-cooled diesel engine producing 120 horsepower at 1,800 revolutions per minute. Japanese engineers took particular pride in the diesel power plant, as it made the vehicle less susceptible to catching fire compared to gasoline-fueled tanks. Diesel supplies were also easier to acquire throughout Japan's territories, especially in regions like Manchuria and Southeast Asia where gasoline was scarce. This engine could operate for 8 to 10 hours using its internal fuel reservoir of 34 gallons, giving it an operating reach of about 130 miles on roads. Testing did reveal certain flaws. The suspension system sometimes pitched violently on uneven ground, making it nearly impossible to aim on the move and causing exhaustion among the crew. The engineering team addressed this by installing connectors between pairs of bogies, creating what became known as the Manchurian suspension. This change helped, but did not fully remedy the rough ride that would typify the Ha-Go over its years of use. In 1935, during an Army Technical Bureau session, the Type 95 was officially introduced as the leading candidate for mechanized infantry unit's main tank. Infantry delegates raised objections, expressing that 12 mm of armor was too thin for a tank expected to assist in assaults against defended positions. Representatives from the cavalry countered with the argument that increased speed and agility made up for the light armor, and that the tank's armament was sufficient for the tasks defined. After lively discussion, the infantry contingent agreed to approve the model. The Type 95 Ha-Go was formally accepted. Its name derived from the imperial calendar, indicating year 2595 since Japan's legendary inception, using only the final 2 digits in its designation. Production commenced at Mitsubishi's manufacturing sites in 1936. The Ha-Go was indeed a compact tank. It was only 4.38 meters in length, 2.06 meters wide, and stood 2.13 meters high. For American standards, these dimensions were 14 feet 4 inches long, 6 feet 9 inches wide, and just under 7 feet in height. A person of medium stature could peer over the turret. The vehicle weighed 7.4 tons as a bare hull, increasing to 8.1 tons after accounting for the crew, fuel, and ammunition. Its armor was considered thin by almost any measure. At its thickest, the turret and upper hull were 12 millimeters of armor, with the roof and floor at 9 millimeters, and some minor areas having just 6 millimeters. The Japanese engineering team calculated that this would be enough to deflect rifle and machine gun fire from expected combat distances. The tank was tailored for anticipated adversaries' Chinese troops with limited anti-tank weapons and light Soviet tanks. The interior was rather cramped. The crew comprised 3 men. The driver occupied the left side in the front hull, with restricted vision afforded by a small slit and a periscope. Beside him to the right sat the hull machine gunner, operating a Type 97 7.7 mm machine gun set in a ball socket. The commander was alone in the turret, standing atop the hull floor as there was no turret basket below. This role was likely the most demanding among Japanese tankers. The commander was responsible for directing the tank, communicating instructions to the driver, and relaying information to other tanks whenever a radio was installed. Radios were present in just 1 out of every 4 tanks, with the rest relying on visible cues. The commander also needed to handle the main armament, a Type 94 37 mm cannon able to fire both high explosive and armor-piercing shells. Loading the main gun, a challenging task due to the tight interior and the need to remain on one's feet, also fell to him. Additionally, he had to operate a secondary machine gun in the rear of the turret, pointing to the right rear area at about the 5 o'clock direction. American tank crews who later inspected captured Ha-Gos were amazed that any individual could remain functional in such a setup. The Japanese tank commander did not have a seat in the turret. He spent combat action standing, with his upper body exposed for better vision when opening the hatch, or shut inside with highly restricted sight when the hatch was down. Rotating the turret needed manual cranking, which required substantial effort. There was scant room to maneuver, let alone fight effectively. Still, within the role for which it was conceived and against the adversaries it expected to battle, the Ha-Go was exceptionally successful. The tank's first notable combat was in China starting in 1937, fighting troops who had nearly no armor support and only marginal anti-tank weaponry. The Ha-Go proved devastating in these conditions. Its 37 mm gun was able to demolish strongpoints and silence infantry threats. The machine guns were deadly to exposed enemy troops. Its mobility enabled Japanese forces to exploit openings and chase down withdrawing units. Japanese tankers developed tactical skills and confidence through these battles. They honed their abilities in settings where their vehicles possessed clear technological superiority. Such success led to a highly risky belief that the Ha-Go was an inherently capable tank, rather than one finely tuned for very specific situations. This belief was put to the test at Khalkhin Gol in 1939, during clashes between Japanese and Soviet forces along the Mongolian border. The Ha-Go now faced foes that could truly fight back. Soviet BT-5 and BT-7 tanks were outfitted with 45 mm guns with superior armor penetration compared to the Japanese 37 mm. Soviet tank armor was also thicker, making it hard for the Ha-Go to engage them head-on effectively. The confrontations were intense. On July 2, 1939, the Japanese 3rd Tank Regiment, largely equipped with Type 95 models, mounted an attack against Soviet positions. The initial action met with some victory due to aggressive maneuvering and the advantage of surprise. Japanese armor destroyed 32 Soviet vehicles and captured 35 more. But the Soviet counter-offensives that soon followed exposed significant weaknesses in the Ha-Go. Soviet tank guns could punch through the Ha-Go's armor at distances where Japanese weapons couldn't reliably affect Soviet tanks. By the time the Khalkhin Gol fighting ended, the Japanese tank force had lost many vehicles. The conclusions were plain for anyone observing events closely. The Ha-Go was technically inferior to the latest Soviet designs. Its thin armor and subpar gunpower were ill-suited for tank duels against similarly advanced adversaries. Nevertheless, the Japanese High Command chose to focus mostly on tactical refinements and additional crew instruction, rather than redesigning the entire armored program. Fighting continued in China, where the Ha-Go still performed well. With the outbreak of the Pacific War in December 1941, Japanese tanks saw impressive victories in Malaya. Ha-Go tanks maneuvered through ground that British military leaders thought impassable for armored units. They advanced through rubber groves and jungle paths, supporting the Japanese Army's rapid movement down the peninsula toward Singapore. British forces, having not sent much armored support to Malaya, found themselves ill-equipped to deal with this type of mobile offensive. In the Philippines, Ha-Gos arrived alongside the main invasion and aided Japanese infantry maneuvers. On December 22, 1941, north of Damortis, Type 95 tanks encountered American M3 Stuart light tanks, marking the first tank-on-tank engagement involving U.S. troops in the Pacific theater. Each tank was armed with 37mm cannons. The M3 featured thicker armor, boasting 32mm on the sides of its turret compared to the Ha-Go's 12mm. However, during close-quarters jungle combat, the Japanese managed some victories, including the destruction of a single M3 in their opening clash. These initial successes only boosted the Japanese soldiers' confidence. To their minds, the Ha-Go was fulfilling its intended role flawlessly. It offered mobility, dependability, and effectiveness in infantry support, no matter the landscape. The tank units trusted the vehicles they operated. Leadership put their faith in their armored assets, and as soon as the command arrived to defend Saipan, the Japanese moved their tanks to the island without doubting their suitability. Saipan presented challenges different from earlier campaigns. This island, part of the Marianas, held immense strategic value, lying just 1,250 miles away from Tokyo. Should the Americans seize Saipan, that would allow their B-29 bombers to strike Japan's main islands. This fact was well understood among the Empire's high command. They strengthened Saipan's defenses with around 30,000 soldiers, almost twice what United States intelligence had anticipated. Included among these defenders was the 9th Tank Regiment, under Colonel Takashi Goto. The regiment's inventory comprised 44 tanks, blending both Type 95 Harrows and the marginally larger Type 97 Chia medium tanks. While the Chias sported more powerful 57mm guns, they shared the same relatively light armor common to Japanese tanks. In terms of armored power in the Pacific, these units formed a substantial force, by far the most formidable the Americans had encountered so far. The American attack commenced on June 15, 1944. Vice Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner gave the order for the invasion troops to begin landing at 0542 hours. By 0700, landing craft made their way toward shore. At 0840, the first units reached land. The 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions advanced onto the western beaches of Saipan, coming under intense bombardment from Japanese artillery and mortars placed on the heights above the landing sectors. The Marines pressed forward, fighting bitterly inland against strong opposition. By the end of June 15, a force of 20,000 American combat personnel had made it ashore. Supplies and equipment were unloaded rapidly on the beaches. M4 Sherman medium tanks also disembarked from LSTs and moved up to reinforce the infantry. Though the Marines established a foothold, it was not completely secure. Japanese artillery remained capable of striking the coastline. Enemy counterattacks persisted through the night hours. On June 16, Marine units solidified their hold on their positions and moved further inland. The 2nd Marine Division focused on closing any existing gaps in their front, while the 4th worked to secure critical terrain features. General Holland Smith, who led the assault, put his reserves in action by bringing in elements of the 27th Infantry Division to strengthen the beachhead. Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, in command of Japanese defenses on Saipan, quickly understood the gravity of the situation. He knew that if American forces managed to consolidate their gains and land all their reserves and equipment, pushing them off the island would no longer be possible. He realized he had to attack before they reached full readiness. Saito gave commands for a substantial counteroffensive utilizing the island's strongest resources, the 136th Regiment's infantry and the 9th Tank Regiment's armor. The directive for the assault was clear. The infantry were to storm the American defenses encircling Karen Kanoa Airfield. The tank detachment's role was to head southwest of Hill 164.6, proceeding once the infantry assault was underway. The tanks would rush the transmitting station to sow confusion among the enemy ranks prior to the infantry pushing through the area. This operation was ambitious, demanding synchronization between foot soldiers and tanks during a nighttime advance over tough ground. Colonel Guto assembled his tank operators. They performed last-minute maintenance on the tanks. Ammunition was loaded: 37mm shells for the Harrows, 57mm for the Chias. Tanks were refueled, track tension adjusted, and radios checked in those vehicles that had them. The crew members felt assured. Many had been in combat before, either in China or in prior operations across the Pacific. They believed in their vehicles and tactical methods. In the darkness before dawn on June 17, the Japanese tank force moved forward. Diesel motors roared to life, their distinct echoes resounding in the pre-dawn quiet. Steel tracks rattled as the tanks assembled and pushed toward the American defenses. Within each tight compartment, the crews sensed the usual shaking and noise of their machines as they moved. Officers stood upright in the turrets, trying to make out shapes in the darkness and coordinating their advance with hand signals. The Americans soon noticed their approach. Marine guards on the perimeter detected sounds of engines from the north. Leaders barked orders. Soldiers hurriedly armed themselves and took up defensive spots. Anti-tank units swiveled their 37mm M3 guns toward the advancing noise. Sherman tank personnel, who had been asleep beside their tanks, hurriedly boarded and started their engines. Machine gun crews double-checked guns and ammo. At 0330 hours, the Japanese pressed their attack in full force. A total of 44 tanks, representing the largest armored grouping fielded by Japan yet in the Pacific, drove toward the 2nd Marine Division's lines. Some tanks carried soldiers gripping onto the exterior, a perilous but occasionally useful maneuver. The attackers navigated the darkness, led by the front tanks and adapting to the landscape toward their targets. Marine riflemen first discerned them as shadowy figures breaking out of the dimness before dawn. Next followed the trademark roar of diesel engines at maximum power, tracks kicking up dirt and dust, bogie wheels clattering, and metal scraping on metal. Japanese tank crews could spot Marines in their positions and the defensive line that lay ahead. Some tank leaders loosed bursts from their hull machine guns, raking the ground. Others held their fire, hoping to close the gap before starting to shoot. Then a surprising event took place. Something occurred that would forever alter Marines' perception of Japanese armored units in the conflict. Marine machine gunners deployed in foxholes and behind concealment opened up with their Browning M2 heavy machine guns. These were not the ordinary 30 caliber machine guns used for general support. Instead, they used 50 caliber heavy machine guns, specialized to strike aircraft and obliterate lightly armored vehicles. The Browning M2.50 caliber was an intimidating weapon, initially created toward the conclusion of World War I and refined over the following decades. This weapon discharged a 12.7 mm projectile with a muzzle velocity that surpassed 2,900 feet per second. The typical ammunition supply consisted of ball cartridges intended for all-purpose use as well as armor-piercing cartridges specifically meant to overcome light armor and defensive structures. The armor-piercing version was capable of breaching 23 mm of face-hardened steel armor plating at a distance of 200 meters. At a range of 500 meters, it was still able to go through 19 mm of armor. These figures were not based on theory. Firing tests at American Ordnance Proving Grounds substantiated them as concrete results. The bullets were developed for attacking lightly armored airplanes and vehicles, not meant for destroying tanks. Nonetheless, the calculations concerning armor penetration are unyielding. The Type 95 Hargo featured armor that was, at most, 12 mm thick on the front and sides of its turret. On its upper hull, the greatest armor thickness found anywhere on the vehicle also measured 12 mm. Plain mathematics made the issue clear. Up close, the .50 caliber armor-piercing rounds could pierce almost double that thickness. At fighting distances 200 meters or less, as tanks neared the Marines' positions, the .50 caliber possessed ample power to penetrate. Marine machine gunners began firing. Tracer ammunition lit the battlefield with sparkling orange-red streaks. The noise was unmistakable, the deep, rhythmic thumping of .50 caliber machine guns booming at a continuous pace. Gunners targeted the oncoming tanks, with some doubting that their firepower could actually harm armored vehicles. What unfolded next surprised both the Japanese and Americans. The .50 caliber armor-piercing bullets did not merely ding the tanks. They did not bounce off at odd angles. Instead, they bored straight through, with authority and finality. At short distances, certain rounds pierced all the way through the fragile armor, puncturing one side of the tank and exiting from the other. Even when the distance increased, the ammunition still managed to breach the armor with substantial force remaining. Inside the Japanese tanks, the crews encountered much worse than simple defeat. They came face to face with a startling realization. The heavy machine gun barrages weren't just noisy clashes on the outer surface. They were successful penetrations, projectiles cutting into and through the armor. Inside the confined space of a Hargo, there was absolutely no place to seek cover. Any round making it through the hull might hit the engine, ammunition storage, or personnel. The face-hardened armor built to withstand rifle bullets gave virtually no significant protection from the formidable .50 caliber projectiles. One Marine operating a machine gun near the airfield recounted seeing his tracer shots strike a Hargo advancing head-on toward his position. Hits landed on the tank's front hull, and he spotted flashes within the tank through its hatches and observation slits. The tank pressed forward briefly before decelerating and eventually stopping. Smoke from the engine began billowing out the rear deck. The crew made a hurried effort to escape. Two soldiers climbed out. They were quickly fired upon by Marines stationed in foxholes. Elsewhere, another machine gunner with his weapon mounted on a half-track targeted a Hargo at roughly 150 meters. He launched a prolonged volley into the vehicle's side armor. The tank turned, exposing more of its side. He continued shooting. His assistant loaded another ammunition belt. The gunner observed as the man in the turret, the commander, buckled forward and fell. The bullet had penetrated the thin armor of the turret, struck the commander, and continued out the opposite side. The commander never realized what had happened to him. A third Marine, stationed at a fixed position on the defensive line and manning his own .50 caliber, engaged several tanks as they closed in. He fired at the engine compartment of one Hargo, focusing on the rear deck where the ventilation openings were situated. His bullets tore through the fragile 6 mm armor shielding the engine. With the diesel engine cylinders breached by .50 caliber hits, it locked up. The tank came to a halt and became an immobile target. The crew deserted the vehicle, fleeing back toward Japanese positions while exposed to a torrent of small arms fire.